Hello, I'm Brian Rook, and today we're going to discuss self-assessment from the business perspective and 360 reviews. 360 reviews are performance appraisals commonly used in business and industry. At Parkview Health in Fort Wayne, Indiana, for example, they conduct a 360 review on every individual every year during the springtime to appraise their performance or to assess their annual work. 360 reviews are used by most businesses as a primary form of assessment or performance appraisal. That's because it's feasible, it's practical, and it's a language that they've become accustomed to in the business and industry side of things. It's also empirically measured and sound between raters. That means all the different people that are contributing to this 360 review, the superior, the peers, the reports, and the other people, there's actually a common ground that's been found to be actually quite accurate and highly correlated between those groups on how they view a particular pattern or measurement rule with that assessee. And so that actually has contributed to placing this as one of the highly desired and used instruments or measurement products in business. The participants that contribute to the 360 reviews are composed of the assessee, the self, as pictured in the model here on the right, the superior or the manager, their peers, that's the self, the assessee's peers, the reports or the direct reports, the people that answer or work for the self assessee, and other. This could be family members, previous co-workers, classmates, somebody that's outside of the organization or outside of the connection between the other three factors. But that's somebody that can also contribute the same type of review and same type of perspective. When a 360 review is completed, and the individual has had a chance to also contribute to their perspective on a strength or a weakness, or assess their abilities or their knowledge in a particular area, then we get back a report similar to what's shown here. In this case, we've used the example of directing others, and what we're gauging is on a 6-point scale. How strong are they? How effective are they with directing others? So we've looked at the different perspective of this. Others have rated them, looks like a 5. Their direct reports have given them a 4, the peers a 5, and their superior or their manager has given them a 4 as well. However, we see here at the very bottom, self, this individual, we'll call them John. John rated himself as a 1. So obviously there's a disconnect with the perspectives here. What happens is allows us, because in self-assessment, John has clearly missed the target here, but this gives us perspective of, well, maybe through John's context it might not be a 5, but based on comparisons from other scores and other perspectives, John's actually quite a bit up there. You can see looks like about a 4.5 on average. So what the advantages of self-rating and using those in a 360 review is that in cases like this, you identify strengths that you might not have known you had. You might have underrated yourself. We could also reverse this chart and have John rating himself as a 4 or a 5, and the rest of the team are rating him as a 1. And in that case, you would also see blind spots, weaknesses that he might not have known existed. And so that's the important piece of this, is that allows us, that's what this is used for in business, is to examine these self-assessments from a full all-around view, so that we can triangulate the different outcomes and identify better through a more accurate lens of the assessment piece. Self-assessment, whether through the 360 process or just as it stands alone, has been the focus of a lot of debate, especially in the scholarly community. Sitzman, Eli, Brown, and Bauer actually conducted a meta-analysis, and really their meta-analysis has become the go-to guide in more recent years of discussion when it comes to self-assessment. They took a lot of the previous research and condensed that, and took really kind of started leading the current date and the modern times and modern expectations and standards for what we view as self-assessment. And actually, a very interesting fact, in 2010 in the journal Academy of Management Learning and Education. There were about 4 publications that were in that journal, all centered around in response to Sitzman et al. So they defined self-assessment as a methodical judgment that individuals use to evaluate their current knowledge levels or improve their knowledge level in a particular area. And in business and industry, we see that self-assessment is, as we said earlier, more commonly used in the 360 performance. It's also used in succession planning, and we see it in personal development that's not necessarily benchmarked by the organization. So what that would mean is if an employee were looking to fill a gap that they might have with their team, they recognize that they're missing something on their team, they'll sit back and through a reflective response, which is the cognitive learning piece, assess whether they're missing a gap, and then they'll set their expectation of what they should be doing. And as they fill that gap, they should ideally be assessing back on whether they, through a reflective process, assessing whether they met that expectation and the desired outcome or not. The effectiveness of self-assessment has been in question quite a bit, basically focusing around the accuracy of it. So when we look at the 2 branches of self-assessment defined through the literature of Sitzman et al., cognitive learning, the piece where we reflect back on whether we met an outcome or not, actually shows a small correlation. So the accuracy on that is not very substantial. It's not very stable. So it's hard to apply any kind of significance to that just based on the small correlation. When we look at effective outcomes, though, something that's actually a benchmark, something that we can tell whether we actually met it or not, there is a moderate to strong correlation to that. The question on that comes into the noise factor, and by noise, what I mean is whenever we're assessing, using self-assessment after a class, for example, are we assessing that and filtering out our likability of the method in which the lesson was disseminated? Did we enjoy the environment that we learned in? Did we enjoy the material? And maybe that's what led to our high rating of self-assessment. Or are we filtering in those things? So that's something that is acknowledged, and that they're further wanting to delineate. Self-assessment has also been tied to influence on marketing. Shalev and Moritz in 2012 wrote that consumers may be deliberate in self-assessing when they compare themselves to others, which in turn influences their purchasing decision. For example, if I were to look at Michael Jordan and admire him and admire his behaviors and his potential as a basketball player, that might influence my decisions on purchasing Michael Jordan shoes, so that I might also meet those qualifications or appear to have those same behaviors. That comes in and filters into my self-assessment. I can also look at the reverse side of that. If I didn't like basketball players and I didn't like Michael Jordan and I thought he was a bad player, I might not buy those shoes because that's my perception of him has affected my self-assessment. So we do see that the self-assessment goes on sometimes even subconsciously, where we're influenced by outside perceptions that we see, and it affects how we make our decision, and it just in everyday things that we do, such as purchasing shoes or purchasing other kind of material that might be indicative of an idol that we have, or somebody that we don't care to look like or be associated with. External factors have a large impact on self-assessment, just as the influential piece that we were talking about with Michael Jordan and the Michael Jordan tennis shoes. Those factors come into our everyday decision making and our assessment pieces that influence and impact our self-assessment from an external influential standpoint. So taking that, Sitzman et al. Really honed in on the self-regulation aspect of it, and there's a lot of important pieces that come out of this. in their literature. The self-regulation is connected to self-assessment, and that it determines the response decisions to the assessment. So what that means is, as I'm doing my self-assessment, and I come to find out that there are some gaps. First of all, do I accept that outcome? Do I accept the motivation? Do I accept that, and do I become motivated to improve to meet those outcomes? And let's take it back to the workplace example. So, a workplace scenario. So, if I'm in working at my job and I find out from my team, my direct reports, that I'm not meeting certain requirements that they need to meet our team goals, then I have to look at that and say, and self-assess whether I'm missing, what am I missing, and to what level am I missing it? What is the benchmark? What are my expectations, and what are the outcomes? And am I motivated to improve myself to reach that? There's also the issue whenever we look at self-assessment, whether I will accept the outcomes. Maybe I won't accept the outcomes, and then again maybe I will accept the outcomes and still not be motivated to improve. So the self-regulation comes into the self-assessment piece too, on whether we actually are motivated or inspired to move forward through the improvement process to meet those outcomes. So, and that's the difficult thing whenever we start separating the individuals from the educational institutions. Whereas educational institutions, we have a structured society where we're expected to learn and expected to perform up to certain things through doing certain tasks that are assigned to us. On the self-assessment side of things, we're really having to rely a lot on the motivational piece. Are we motivated to improve within ourselves? And that's where we really see a major difference and divergence between the two areas, from business and industry, using the independent individual to also the educational aspect. The external influences and the questioning of the accuracy in self-assessment has led to quite a bit of concerns. Basic research has shown that learning is multidimensional. So it is very justified that researchers prefer multiple measurements, as do even businesses and industry. They prefer to look at things not just from the self-assessment aspect, but there are metrics and dashboard analytics that we have to tie ourselves to that show proof of impact and show proof of performance. And so we're still connected to those. So there is a concern and a desire for multiple measurements, just as it should be, basing it off of the multidimensional educational part. The thing that comes into play, though, with when we get outside of educational institutions, when we start looking at business and industry, the feasibility comes into play. A lot of organizations are hesitant to commit certain levels of finances to multiple measurements, to formal assessment programs. So while we do have some different surveys and techniques that we can bring in, the cost on those contracts are really high and sometimes not justifiable by the organization. And you have to also consider the return on that investment. So if they are considering to use that formal assessment piece, are they actually getting a financial return out of that or not? And we have to look at that from the individual perspective as well. So an individual, they might not have the actual means or the finances to afford some formal type of assessment or to be able to tie that connection. So that's where the self-assessment has to come in. We have to consider that and allow that is going to happen, that self-assessment does occur around us, and we engage in self-assessment on a regular basis. But how can we take that piece and tie that, use some kind of method or some way of creating an objective approach to that measurement so that we can filter out as much noise as possible? And how are there ways that we can triangulate, such as the 360 does? We're using a perspective approach, so it's subjective. However, we're able to tie that down to an average and look at that from a triangulated perspective and actually get a much more accurate picture. Andrade and Valcheva in 2009 actually recommended a model for self-assessment, or a method that we could
create some kind of structure to how we conduct self-assessment. And the three steps put forward by those researchers was articulating the expectations, creating what do we expect the outcome to be, having some kind of benchmark or some kind of actual endpoint that we can clearly measure and identify whether we met that or not. Then we start the self-assessing process, and it's a process. So as you continue forward, if it's a 6-month goal that you have, maybe each month you're assessing and looking for improvement, and that's where the revising piece comes into play as well. Once we look at the self-assessing piece, are we improving? Are we getting closer to what our expectations are, what our outcome is, or not? And how do we, if we're not, how do we revise what we're doing to readjust and ensure that we are headed towards the right goal? That's the model that's put forward by them that helps keep that self-assessment piece structured so that we're at least using a methodical approach to that. Although a lot of research has been done with self-assessment and a lot of methods put forward, just as Andrade and Victor have, we still have a lot of areas that we need to focus our research on in the future. And the biggest thing is minimizing noise or distraction with self-assessment. How do we eliminate that? And then also focusing on self-assessment and its effectiveness with succession planning in business and industry. That's something that we don't have any kind of ground in really. And when we look at succession planning, what that means is moving up in position and increasing in role and responsibilities within the organization. So when we look at self-assessment with that piece, a lot of us are looking at from our individual self-assessment, we're self-assessing and then determining what do we need to do to get into position for advancement in my career. And there's not anything that's really connected to that, and that's an area that could really benefit from research on this. Is how accurate are we whenever we self-assess for succession planning? Most researchers do. There is quite a bit of debate, and rightfully so, on the effectiveness of self-assessment. But all researchers, and really Sitzman et al., have stopped short of saying that it's a poor practice. And that's because there are some substantial things to it. There are some things about self-assessment that are very effective and very good practices. But to an extent, it's not to be fully relied upon because there are a lot of flaws in the self-assessment, a lot of noise and distractions that come in as well. But that's the overview of what self-assessment is, where it is, where it's come, and how we use it in business and industry, and its importance, and also where we see it moving in the future and some areas in need. Thank you very much.